This is Anthony of Philosophy Cafe, where we visit the writings in philosophy that you may have or have not read with the purpose of arriving at new questions, thoughts, and ideas on the spot in an unbounded and unapologetic way. You can think of it as an audiobook/podcast experience all in one, so feel free to join me in the reading and reevaluation of these timeless concepts that must evolve as we do. This is for all of you out there that are abstractly curious and don't even know why. All right, today we are taking a look at Meditations by the Marcus Aurelius. This is a very interesting one because it has really stood the test of time. We're talking like 2,000 years if you are not familiar with this work, but it is definitely a staple of Stoicism, and Stoicism has seen to have some sort of rebranding, a resurgence in recent times. It's almost replaced self-help, and a lot of people, if you're familiar with Ryan Holiday, as many are, and the Daily Stoic, he's doing some great work out there to promulgate these ideas and to express that of the works of Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and Epictetus and so forth, and a lot of the writers from those time that had founded Stoicism. So it's really cool to see us revisit it now today, and I hope we can do that also with other literature and philosophy and other styles. But this is definitely one that has helped, inspired so many people meditate on themselves, their life. And if you're not familiar with Stoicism, Stoicism is essentially just the philosophy that you don't control what happens to you in life, but you definitely control how you respond. So I'm going to take a look over here at book 8 or chapter 8, if you may. And I just wanted to pick a random section, one without too much context, because in philosophy you can sort of do this, because with these types of works, sometimes you can pick out any chapter and still glean something meaningful from it. And we're just going to dive in and see what we can do here. So let's start off with book 8 of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. This reflection also tends to the removal of the desire of empty fame, that it is no longer in thy power to have lived the whole of thy life, or at least thy life from thy youth upwards, like a philosopher, but both to many others and to thyself it is plain that thou art far from philosophy. Thou hast fallen into disorder, so that it is no longer easy for thee to get the reputation of a philosopher, and thy plan of life also opposes it. If then thou hast truly seen where the matter lies, throw away the thought. How thou shalt seem to others, and be content if thou shalt live the rest of thy life in such wise as thy nature wills. Wow, it is so interesting reading this out loud, and it's definitely a different exercise than that of reading it just to yourself, because you really have to get used to this form of dialect, this type of English, right? Even though it, of course, is translated. Very interesting to read aloud when you hear the thys and shalts and thous. It's very interesting, but let's not deviate too far away from the context itself. Something I do want to point out, and something that, if you have read the book before, Marcus Aurelius does this fairly often. He does refer to the philosopher, so he really has a potent aim at this concept of being a philosopher, and my approximation of that is that philosopher is being the highest version of yourself as a Stoic, right? So it seems to be in this initial passage of book 8 here that Marcus Aurelius is telling us that if we're not living like the philosopher, or like the ideal that a philosopher can be, then we must be living in some sort of disorder. And we need to understand that there are a lot of parallels here with what it means to live as a philosopher and that of according to nature, right? So to live like a philosopher in his eyes is to live with nature. Otherwise, there's a deviation from your life, or from your truth, or from what you can be, because nature is actually the greatest principle that gives us credence, that gives us the ability to be who we truly are. And what I find very fascinating about this recurring theme is that there's a theme of acceptance here, right? Again, when you look at Stoicism, it's not about what happens to you, it's about how you respond. So it's about having this sort of acceptance for your life, for the cards you've been dealt. Not that you can't change them, and that you can change them, but in order to change them, there must be some adherence to nature, to the way that things are, to not really resist them too much, and to have a sort of acceptance. And this is where you will find your center. This is where you will find your truth, and this is where you find that you will be able to navigate your best foot forward, right? So it's really cool to see him still over here in book 8. He mentions this quite a bit in earlier chapters as well. And also, what I want to say, if you are not familiar with this work. What's so cool is this was never intended to be published. These were his secret meditations, or his private notes, if you may, that he had wrote to himself as emperor of the Roman Empire. So it's very cool to actually see how this has so much impact on so many other people in their life, and how many different interpretations we can gain from it. But that's just a side note there. All right, so let's continue forward though. Observe then what it wills, and let nothing else distract thee, for thou hast had experience of many wanderings, without having found happiness anywhere, not in syllogisms, nor in wealth, nor in reputation, nor in enjoyment, nor anywhere. Where is it then, in doing what man's nature requires? How then shall a man do this, if he has principles from which come his effects and his if he has principles from which come his effects and his acts? What principles? Those which relate to good and bad, the belief that there is nothing good for man which does not make him just, temperate, manly, free, and that there is nothing bad which does not do the contrary to what has been mentioned. On the occasion of every act, ask thyself, how is this with respect to me? Shall I repent of it? A little time and I am dead, and all is gone. What more do I seek, if what I am now doing is work of an intelligent living being and a social being, and one who is under the same law with God? See, here we go to this recurring pattern, this adherence with nature, this concept of acceptance for your life and what naturally exists, and trying not to violate that too much, and not trying to upset the gods is another way that Marcus Aurelius has put it before as well. So I do want to point out before moving forward here that there are these fundamental pillars of Stoicism, and they're somewhere along the lines of justice, reason, wisdom, and temperance. And you can see that he has mentioned here specifically, make him just, temperate, manly, free, and that there is nothing bad which does not do the contrary to what has been mentioned. So these are some fundamental pillars of Stoicism itself, and this is what carries the throne of Stoicism that people who call themselves Stoics tend to want to live by. And I do want to make a note of the manly part here. I think the manly part is just the actualization of man, right? Of being a human. And of course, they did reference, that there were differences between men and women, that of which we know not to be very correct. Like Aristotle back in the day thought that women, when they were upset or when they were acting out of line, so to speak, that they were just being hysterical and it was unnecessary. And of course, it was an old time. Let's definitely say that. We don't have to take everything for such truth and such fact. But let's laser back into these pillars here, these important pillars of justice, reason, wisdom, and temperance. And these seem to be the guiding factors that allow one to know whether they are being Stoic or not, whether they're thinking like a Stoic, and Marcus Aurelius fairly repeats them over here. So let's continue forward. Alexander and Caius and Pompeius, what are they in comparison with Diogenes and Heraclitus and Socrates? For they were acquainted with things and their causes, and there's a bracket forms here, in their manner, and the ruling principles of these men were the same. But as to others, how many things had they to care for, and how many things were they slaves? Consider that men will do the same thing, nevertheless, even though thou shalt burst. This is the chief thing. Be not perturbed, for all things are according to the nature of the universal, and in a little time thou wilt be nobody and nowhere, like Hadrian and Augustus. In the next place, having fixed thy eyes steadily on thy business, look at it, and at the same time remembering that it is thy duty to be a good man, and what man's nature demands. Do that without turning aside, and speak as it seems to thee most just. Only let it be with a good disposition, and with modesty, and without hypocrisy. There we go. We are hit with another intense phrase over here. Something I want to bring our attention to is do you believe that there's a difference between human nature and nature's nature, right? Because we keep falling into this pattern again of understanding and adherence with nature, and that our greatest self seems to be in line with the nature, right? So we talk about these principles, or Marcus had brought up these principles of good and bad, and it seems to be that our nature is actually coherent with nature's nature. Like, what is the nature of nature itself, and what is our nature? Where do we deviate? I think these are the questions that we need to ask ourselves to better understand if we are in line with nature, if nature are representing these fundamental pillars, again, of justice, reason, wisdom, and temperance. It's like nature decides these concepts. They decided these pillars for us already, and we must be the ones to choose to act in accordance with it, right? Because the good, or this concept of the good, allows one to become that of the Stoic. Like this is what it means. If you technically check all those boxes, if you embody those boxes or those pillars more specifically, then you are becoming a good Stoic, and or the philosopher that Marcus has alluded to. This seems to be the highest form of self and service. And this is where I think there's an integration of nature. I don't think it's simply just nature as the tree that exists outside. I do think there's some merit to that. But I also think what it means to be in adherence with nature is to be of service to other people, at least in reference to stoicism. It's being of the greatest service to both yourself, which in turn allows you to be in the greatest service of others, because we are nature's beings at the end of the day. He also references this concept of being in the same law with God. And you have to think, back in the day, of their relationship with God very well was very different, with different concepts, different religions, even different relationships with death itself, right? So when he says being under the same law with God, I wonder if their relationship was similar, or how similar their relationship to God was as the religious people do have today, right? I think it's a fascinating question to ask, because obviously when you look at ancient Greek mythology, it's not monotheistic, it's polytheistic, right? With multiple types of gods, and the gods resemble different abstractions or different concepts or elements of human nature, with, let's say, truth and modesty and strength and beauty and so forth. So it's really cool to see Marcus here tackle this question of what it means to be in law with God, or this concept of God that resembles these fundamental tenets of human nature. Something else, there's just so much I feel like I could try to go on about, and I think that we need to ask, but I really did want to pinpoint this bracket that he pointed here beside the sentence. Let me find it here, where he says, "For they were acquainted with things and their causes," and in brackets there's this concept of forms. Now, in Platonic philosophy, Plato's theory of forms, these forms exist outside of us. They are essentially the blueprint that give life its form itself, that allow us. We don't experience them directly, we experience sensations, we experience representations of this form or this truth. For example, there's no such thing that we can experience as a perfect triangle, but it exists because it gives the representations and the form and the other form of a triangle to exist in our material world, right? So it's really cool that he mentions and references this concept of their truth, because he says their causes. So he's essentially mentioning that these pillars, or that these laws that we live under, that allow us to cohere with living a good life, that of the rule under God, is actually allowing us to get some sort of a glimpse of what these forms are without interacting with them. And we understand that there is a cause to these things, and the cause is the form itself. It's, again, very Platonic in nature. And these forms in ancient Greek philosophy, they exist as the essence of being in the abstract. They aren't the existence itself that we experience, they're the essence, as they have been called in historic philosophy or classical philosophy. Also, Marcus Aurelius here seems to reference these actions with respect to forms. It's not just the concept of adhering to a form by way of reverence, by having reverence for it. It's actually acting on it. Again, let's look at these fundamental pillars of justice, reason, wisdom, and temperance. These can all be enacted and embodied out, and this is what allows one to again be that Stoic philosopher that allows Marcus to be the philosopher king that he is, or once was. The forms themselves, they don't have to be these godly figures. They can be represented as godly figures, but instead they're actually these guiding principles that shape life itself. That's what it means that's essentially the meaning here, or an interpretation of this concept of form. It's not that they have to be a god or they have to be religious in nature, but they just kind of carve out a space in the abstract where guiding principles exist outside of us and inform how we act in our lives, that we experience through our actions, through our representations and sensations and so forth. So many ways that could be described. I'd love to hear some interpretations you may have of that, especially that of Platonic philosophy, because we still reference Plato today and are still battling with this concept of the abstract and understanding where to really locate it in our brains, because it's immaterial in nature, but we understand that there is so much more unknown than there is known, and and that there is so much that exists outside of us. We just don't know exactly how to categorize that properly, or at least have many other ways to do so. So I think we can definitely keep going from therein. Trying to find exactly where I finish off. Perfect. With modesty and without hypocrisy. All right, wonderful. Let's keep at it. The nature of the universal has this work to do, to remove to that place the things which are in this, to change them, to take them away hence, and to carry them there. All things are changed, yet we not need fear anything new. All things are familiar to us, but the distribution of them still remains the same. Every nature is contented with itself when it goes on its way well, and a rational nature goes on its way well, when in its thoughts it assents to nothing false or uncertain, and when it directs its movement to social acts only, and when it confines its desires and aversions to the things which are in its power, and when it is satisfied with everything that is assigned to by the common nature. For of this common nature, every particular nature is a part. And as the nature of the leaf is a part of the nature of the plant, except in that in the plants the nature of the leaf is a part of the nature which has not perception or reason, and is subject to be impeded. But the nature of man is part of nature which is not subject to impediments, and is intelligent and just, since it gives everything in equal portions and according to its worth, times, substance, cause, in brackets, form again, activity, and incident. But examine not to discover that any one thing compared with any other single thing is equal in all respects, but by taking all the parts together of one thing and comparing them with all the other parts together of another. Fascinating. And we're only a couple pages into book 8, and there's so much to dissect here in and of itself. I definitely want to acknowledge this concept of how can we put this here? I think when we talk a lot about principles, Marcus Aurelius here seems to acknowledge that you kind of become slave to ideology when you care about the principles that are not in the form of forms, or not by this, are not represented in this causality of forms that are justice, reason, wisdom, and temperance. That there actually is such a vast multitude out there of different principles, and the ones that aren't really that of the natural forms, that are not of these pillars of stoicism, that are not just, that are not intelligent, that are not rational, actually force you to become slave to ideology. Let's say you can say that one of these principles are pleasure, for example. Let's say you have that as a principle, or at least you acknowledge it as a principle. Just because it's a principle in and of itself doesn't mean that it's one that you don't become a slave to. You become a slave to pleasure when it becomes your highest order of principles and instead replaces these fundamental pillars of stoicism. That's why it seems to be such a benchmark to understand what these pillars are, and how to enact them properly, and how to question them properly, so that you can understand them and move your life with them, and with loyalty towards them, because you can make a principle almost out of anything. And I think that's the point that he's making here by having this, again, adherence to nature, and recognizing that there are so many different principles that one can have, and that it's important to have the right principles, and what the right principles are that according to nature, or else those principles are just an ideology that you become slave to. And I think that's the dissection that he makes here. It's fascinating, because it seems like the forms themselves are provided by nature, and the rest is just fabricated. The rest are principles that we've actually come up with. So that's how, if we can identify which forms come from nature, then we understand the way of the good life. We understand the way of truth. And I think that's why these questions and concepts have been circulating for millennia. So interesting to see also these parallels with Eastern philosophy, such as that of Taoism. If you're familiar with Lao Tzu and the Tao, and this accordance with living with nature, that nature knows best, and if you live in harmony, it means that you live in accordance with nature. There's so many parallels here. It's really cool to see these different philosophies, especially in vastly different geographic areas, transfer in concept, in cadence, and in thought process. But I do also want to add to this concept of ideology by saying that it seems to be what Marcus is saying, that you can know if you're becoming a slave to ideology when your actions when you reverence the things that are not of those stoic pillars, right? So I'm curious then, like, what's the psychology of those pillars? What's the psychology? What's the relationship one has to have with a concept like temperance? Can you still act in accordance with temperance while being a slave to another ideology? Like, think of a multi-dimensional or a very complex villain in a movie, right? Sometimes there's something that we feel bad for them because we understand maybe they have these good intentions, or they have a certain type of loyalty to them, or a certain type of rationale to them that allows us to feel like, oh wow, there's actually trying to thread the good life or a good path, but they're also being distracted. They're also being overcome and overwhelmed by these other principles that they're living by, which is overwriting that of these stoic principles, right? So I'm curious. I'd love to hear what you think about what the psychology of our relationship is to these pillars of stoicism. Again, I repeat, justice and reason and wisdom and temperance, and there are others, but these seem to be recurring in particularly this work here. So I'd love to hear what questions you have, what interpretations you've come across. It's so funny. Ryan Holiday, I just saw, it was an ad of his yesterday, talking about how on his site he actually has a course on how to read meditations, and supposedly he's read this book hundreds of times, and he says that he gleans something new from it every single time, which I definitely don't doubt just from going over a couple pages here with you guys. And it seems to be that he has a roadmap or a way to dissect this book in the most effective, efficient way, and here we are doing that together here. So I hope that was beneficial. I hope it opened up a new line of questioning, or a new way to read this. And it's been a fun journey, a lot for me to think about for the rest of the day and moving forward as well. So I can't wait to revisit this one with you guys. Let me know what you think, and if you have any recommendations on some other works to go through, feel free to let me know. Enjoy, thank you so much, and we will see you on the next one.